So I thought, firstly, thank you for joining us today.
My
and
pleasure.
I thought we'd start and try and trace back to the start of your career. What was it first about acting, writing, directing, the arts more generally, that really appealed to you?
I started off as a singer, actually, as I may have said in other incarnations myself. And my dream was to be, and I'm slightly embarrassed to say it, but my dream was to be like the kind of British Lionel Richie. I'm going to stop saying that very soon. And there was something about, on a serious note, there was something about music and about art. I didn't know it was art then, but there was something about music that I felt very deeply within me, and that I could see the effect of music on all those around me. In particular, I could see the effect of music on my father. And my father was a relatively Victorian man, Edwardian probably in terms of manners, and so he's quite quiet. And then music would come on, and he would transform into the life of the party. I would see, as a member of the Windrush generation, I would see the cold fall off him as he danced, as he smiled, as he reminisced. And then later, I would say, it was looking at the drama Roots on television that I said probably changed my life. And I think it was then that I really knew that that the arts and literature would be the thing that I would most crave to be part of all of my life.
What was it about Roots in particular?
My favourite saying is that history is like a foreign land. They do things differently there. To describe what London, what England was like in the 1970s and 80s when I was growing up sounds very alien. I grew up with only a paragraph in my history books about how I came to be as a diasporic African. There was a small, maybe 12 lines on the slave trade. And there was an absolute disconnect between the African and the African Caribbean community, and a real disconnect between the African Caribbean community and a sense of their African roots. That was not an accident. It was on purpose. It was by design. And so, and I grew up in a world where I walked out into the streets and people would say, or white English people would say, go back to the jungle. Didn't quite know what that meant. And then I would go to the Caribbean with my parents, and they'd say, oh, go home, you Englishman. And then I would go to Ghana, and people would say, oh, you're Bob Marley, right? And I'd be like, I don't belong anywhere. Oh my God, I'm a universal alien. And there was something about Roots that actually told my story in specificity. And there was a moment, I remember it really clearly, at about 12, when I was standing in the doorway of our TV room. A TV room, like if the only thing in the room was a TV. It was in the living room. And I saw the scene where Kunta Kinte was being whipped, and they were saying, what is your name? And he said Kunta, and he said Toby. And he said, no, Kunta, and he was whipped, and then whipped, and then whipped again. And eventually at the end of that scene, that most painful scene, when he was close to death, he then accepted the status of Toby, at least on the surface. And I remember turning to my mother and saying, I'm going to trace our ancestry. I'm going to get us back to Africa. And she said, of course you are, darling. Now go and do your homework. And then, if I trace it back, I go, that was the most important moment of my youth, was being able to say, oh, that's who I am. That's why I have the name of someone who enslaved me, or enslaved me personally, enslaved an ancestor. And that's why I feel I'm alone in the country of my birth, because this is the history that was not revealed to me. And again, now we all know it, right? We've all seen 12 Years a Slave, and we've all seen 1 or 2 slave narratives, so we think we know it. But then we had no access to it. And it was the works of Alex Haley that opened my eyes to the power of art to change the direction of one's life. Not dreams, not ambitions, but the trajectory of your life. Literature did that. Art did that. And then I think I was baptized in the fire of art at that moment.
So what was that like personally, going on that journey to try and uncover your heritage and your roots? What was that like?
Kind of beautiful. Of course I would say that it took 5 years-ish. But kind of beautiful. A sense of discovery, you know, a sense of learning. I found myself, when people were able to just kind of do DNA things and kind of just do the swab, and then they could go, oh, I'm from that region. I got really angry. I was like, it took me years of going into libraries, and now you could just do that. But then actually I rejected that, because in doing this story, it meant that I had to talk to my grandfather about things that he had not spoken about before. And then I had to speak to my great-grandmother, who, when I went to Grenada in 1990, who was about 98. And because I'd done a lot of research about the family, actually there were moments when her family, an immediate family around her, said, no, this is a moment of her being senile. But actually I knew some of her stories. And so actually she was remembering things that those around her didn't know. She was talking about a house that her husband had built that got blown down in the hurricane of 1942. And of course, the contemporaneous family didn't know it, but I knew the story. I was like, oh, I know that. That's Mr. Isaac's house. And her eyes opened because no one had recognized that. And so I found out stories about my great-grandfather, who was a man who reportedly did acts of great kindness. And then at the moment that people were about to repay him for that kindness, would just disappear. And he did it in a neighboring island of Trinidad. And another time he was from his family, half of his family, he was mixed race. And he felt so, not conflicted about being mixed race is not my understanding. He felt conflicted about being born of privilege in an island that was so stratified. And so the kind of currency of the day would be, if you were black, was how close you were in complexion to those who were Caucasian. And he rejected that orthodoxy by everything that I have read and that I had heard. And rather than live in the city, he ran into the mountains and he married the darkest skinned woman he could find and told her nothing about his family. He literally just ran away, and eventually one day, one of his brothers found him because he really was deep in the hinterland. And told the family the story, that he was actually of wealth. And my grandfather told me the story of coming in to the house and seeing his father for the first time fighting another man. And he didn't know who this man was that he was fighting because he was like, how dare you tell the story? How dare you tell my family really who I am? I've not told them this. And now you've just revealed part of my life that I didn't wish to share. So that's the long way round of saying it was beautiful because I got to learn about family members that I wouldn't have known. I got to stand in the slave forts that my great-great-grandfather had walked from, and to be able to do that, to be able to do that journey, really was a very beautiful experience.
And then it seems that you said that in history textbooks there's only a certain number of lines, and art really up until now has been the only way to kind of connect back with and uncover the truth. But what do you think education-wise, or the government can do, or anyone can do to try and allow this, or universities can do to try and actually go back over their own history, re-examine British history and our past, and try and reassess and uncover the truth of our history?
I think it's always hard, isn't it, to place the onus. We live in on government or on institutions. Only because we live in a very individualistic world, where actually that we believe in our psyche on the whole that somehow we should do it ourselves. And to a degree, I believe that the job of educating a community about its own history is actually slightly incumbent upon the family and the community to teach their own history, because invariably history is written by the victor, and you have to find your way of making sure that that your perspective has been fully represented, not exclusively, not at the expense of any other culture, but just telling your own stories. So I think that's important. I also think that our institutions are fundamentally born on notions of Eurocentrism. And that's really hard. That is tribalism. And that's really hard to undo. And so we can ask for Black History Month or Black History Year. We can ask for different, for different ways of analyzing how we have become a first world nation, the fifth largest economy in the world. I think we can ask that, but actually, we're actually asking our country to examine itself in a way that is very, very, very painful and disavows us of the false notions of superiority that many of our foundational stories of nation has been based on. So I suppose it's, again, the long way round of saying that that it is about individuals and families to find, and communities, to find their stories, to transmit their stories to the next generation. And then it is up to our academic institutions to then recognize these to be equal truths, not the stories of an ethnic minority, but actually the stories of global majorities.
And then how do you use art, or how do you revisit art such as classical works and classical texts that themselves have deeply problematic writers or backstories or narratives? How do you use them, or can you not use them?
I think that's a rather brilliant question, and one that I'm wrestling with relatively every day. I think that what we have discovered, if I just look at it through the lens of gender politics, is that when you try to program a classic, due to the history of patriarchy, it's really hard to find more than 10 classic plays that everybody knows the title of, that everybody will flock to see, that are written by women historically. I'm not talking about modern drama. I'm talking about historic text. Now, we know that's not because women were inferior. It's not because women couldn't write. It's not because women didn't have the burning desire to articulate themselves and their stories and put them down on paper or have people make them manifest. It's not. We know that that was the system. And so I think what we're finding now in drama is that much of the canon has to be examined through the lens of, is it still fit for purpose? Can we still, should we still be doing these? Now my feeling is that art is art is art, and so we should never censor. But what we should do is look at the classics and cut the bits that don't work, or challenge the casting. So that the casting, I don't just mean in terms of colour-blind casting. One of the things I'm very interested in right now, and we're discussing at the Young Vic, is whether all of the classics that we produce, whether we'll cast them gender neutrally. And just the director just says, I say, the theatre wishes that you don't have to cast men, you don't have to cast women, I just want you to find the best actor for it. And then with that, one hopes that we'll be able to look at the canon and appreciate its brilliant thematic resonances, but also find a way to let it serve us contemporaneously.
And then do you find that the audience needs to be receptive to this? And I ask, in being an artistic director in America and the United Kingdom, is there a difference?
Yes and no. When I first went to Baltimore, it was one of the best lessons that I had. My opening show was Ibsen's Enemy of the People. Actually, it was Arthur Miller's adaptation of it. And I was a bit like, look, in Britain, we just cast the best actor. So, you know, let's just, and this is pre-Hamilton American theatre, right? And really, Hamilton changed everything. It changed the universe. And so the best actor came in, And for the brothers, if anybody knows Enemy of the People, it's about two brothers. One's the mayor, and the other's the doctor. And the doctor discovers that the water is poisoning the people. And the mayor says, but we can't put that information out because if we do, we'll crash. And so it's a battle of their wills. And so I cast a white actor to play the mayor and a black actor to play the doctor. And actually they were going to swap. What was really interesting is that I got so many letters saying, this is outrageous. You do know statistically that one brother white is like one in a million. I was like, yo, this is art, son. I was like, you know that when we walk into the room that we leave your literal mind at the door. You know, like you come in and this is the palace of disconnection. I don't need it to be literal, but it got panned. And it was a lesson for me because it meant that I hadn't listened, actually. I didn't know. I kind of landed in America, said, I'm here with my grand British self. And of course you're going to like what I do. And I'm going to, and again, because I say it's pre-Hamilton and it was a regional theatre, not necessarily New York, it became something that I had to slowly win back, that I had to win their trust. And I had to find a way to get back to the place, and we did in our last season, where I could cast anyone that I felt for any of the roles. And that wasn't something that I felt that we were fighting in Britain. However, we were fighting a different battle in Britain. We were fighting gender. When the Donmar Warehouse did the all-female Shakespeares, there were critics writing saying, this is disgusting, this is the end of the world as we know it. This is, and actually what Josie and Kate did was say, no, we actually want to make sure that our actors, our female actors, get to do whatever the bleep bleep they want, so long as they have the talent. And so there is a difference. But there is also commonalities in that we're all fighting the structural inequalities that we've been born into. And I think the job of my generation of artistic director is to make sure that the next generation of artistic director doesn't have to fight the same battles. That actually we're at a place where intersectionality is we just take it, that we just do. And that actually that we're creating new work for the canon. That actually, that a friend of mine said something, and I don't necessarily mean that one should do this, but she said that if every theatre in England only commissioned black writers for the next 10 years, even then we wouldn't have parity in terms of plays produced, in terms of air miles. And I think it's really interesting. We have to re-examine the canon, and we have to create a new canon, so that the next generation can stand on the shoulders of that.
And then my final question before we hand over is, do you think that there's now growing momentum? Do you feel as though that actors, directors, audiences, producers, people with finances behind the scenes are actually awakening to this? They're actually getting on board with the kind of re-examination and the process? I
absolutely do. It's a really exciting time to be an artistic director. I've said this a few times. The overwhelming majority in this room, I think, belong to the greatest generation that has ever lived. I'm so excited by the minds of young people. I'm so excited by the bravery and the activism of young people. When I was growing up, it was really hard to even see yourself as an activist. You kind of hid it and you kind of whispered, yeah, we're going to fight the power. And this generation is coming out and describing themselves on their CVs as producer activists, as actor activists, as composer activists, and like coming into the buildings and going, how do we, not just how do we rip this down, but how do we reconfigure it so it's fit for purpose, and it's our moral right to do that. And actually funders going, yeah, I think you're right. And artists going, thank God you're right. It's a most exciting time to be an artist in theatre. I love this generation.
Well, what a good time to open questions up to this generation. So if you want to put your hands up and wait for the microphone to be brought to you, and then stand up when you do. Yeah, we'll go to that hand there first if we can, madam.
Thank you so much for coming and all the work you're doing. It's amazing. I just wanted to ask a question. I've found, like, going to the Young Vic since you've been there, and recently, that, like, even audiences have changed a lot, as in terms of colour, more people of colour and stuff like that. But still, going to lots of different theatres across, like, London, it's still just such a white audience, such an old, elderly audience as well. Not that many young people. I mean, even things like the opera houses or something like that are still so, like, white old people. And it's interesting because there's so many cutting edge directors working in for the Royal Opera House, say like Deborah Warner or something like that. How do you think we can change audiences and, like, what they look like?
Well, first of all, I love my old white audience as much as I love my young, funky audience of colour. And I don't say that to sit on the fence. Someone asked me this the other day. I think I did a talk at a school earlier on this week. And I profoundly believe, as an artistic director, our job is to keep the audience that come and to invite new audiences in. And one shouldn't cancel out the other. I think in a city like London with 40% people of colour, that actually the debate about spaces not being fully integrated or fully representative of the city that it lives in is problematic. And it's problematic, and I know that every artistic director, that everyone who works in theatres or art galleries or in the opera houses, they really want the audiences to be representative of their location. And they want that not just actually in terms of cultural philanthropy. They actually want it because the audiences are going to die, and the new generation audience needs to look. You know, it's an economic argument. It's not even, hey, I want to do this because I love people of color. Do you know what I mean? It's like, yo, I need your money. Probably not in that accent, but alas. And I think that what I don't want to do ever is kind of go, guess what? The old guard didn't care. The old guard did care, and the old guard created a baseline for us to be able to have this debate right now. I don't think it's easy, though. I think we have been reared. A really interesting thing, at least for me, when I was at Baltimore, we did a little bit of research, and we discovered that 70% of our tickets were bought by women, but only 10% of the plays on our stages were directed by women or written by women. 70% to 10. And that actually is universal in Britain and America. I think it's like 69% here. And so all of a sudden we started to think about, how do we change that? And not how do we wave the flag and talk about it, but how do we change that structural imbalance? And so actually in the first year, once we discovered that, and then went, okay, great, I want 80% of the work on our stages to be produced by women and directed by women. And what was really interesting about it, and we never went under about 50%, I was really pleased to say. And we never spoke about it, we just did it. And what was really interesting was by the second year, women, again without me articulating it, were coming up to us and saying, oh, there's something different about the work that's happening on stage. Not always being able to identify that actually what they were looking at and what they were feeling was that we were not just doing masculine Aristotelian narratives. We were using female dramaturgy. Masculine dramaturgy, as we all know from the movies, it goes like that, right? And there's a wall, punch your way through it, and then you fall down, and then you climb up, and then there's another obstacle, and you punch your way through it, and you jump over that wall, and then you blow everything up, and then you keep going, and then you trip, and then you're at the low, and now you're at the end of Act 2, and you're at your lowest, and then you go, I'm going to climb over that final big hurdle, and I'm going to blow it up, and then bam, and you jump over that final big hurdle, and bam, we're at resolution, and isn't it great? And actually, I discovered, or we discovered, that female dramaturgy actually went in circles. That actually went round and round and round and went deeper and deeper and deeper. And then actually when it struck oil, the oil came up all over the place. 5 or 6 different locations, and it was a different way of storytelling. And I think that's the same with audiences. That I think we have to find the female dramaturgy. I don't just mean doing black or brown plays using the same superstructure that we've inherited. But I mean, it's how do we innovate? How do we find our own way of telling stories that lets every community actually intuitively, not cerebrally, feel, oh, something's different here. And that's part of my challenge. Does that answer that?
Yeah, let's have the hand over here, Adam.
Hi, thank you for coming. I have 2 questions, if that's okay. One, when I go to audition for things, or I read character profiles in a play, it'll often say, you know, Toby, young man, pensive, and then it'll be like Susie, black, and this, or like Priya, Indian descent. Why do you think that like people of Caucasian descent, or Caucasians, get to exist as anybody that they want to be, but like BME characters are so, they're like, obviously it's part of our identity, but why do you think we can't exist as anything? And I always think, why can't I be Susan? Like, yeah, sure, cast another Indian person as Priya, but why can't I go for just a general character that doesn't have a color attached to them? But then equally, do you think that that is to assure diversity in theatre? Like, do you actually think maybe by attaching a race identity to characters, it ensures that at least those characters are diverse? So I guess, do you think that's a good thing? And then my second question is, how do you find a balance between theatre that is for a group of people, that is, you know, directed at a specific group of people, and that talks to them and it's personal to them, and balance that off or trade that off with theatre that is for everyone and that should have wide reach appeal? Like, yeah, how do you find that balance?
Good. You may have to remind me of the first question, but I'm gonna attack the second one first, if I may. You know, Mark Ravenhill once said to me, I used the word universal many years ago, and he said, you know that's a really loaded word, right? Because really what we mean by universal is white people understand it, right? And I was just like, oh yeah, that's true. Like, you might have all black versions of a story, you know. Oh yeah, I understand it now, and that also that white authors invariably get to be universal. You know, that you go in and you can adapt the Chinese fable, and you can go in and adapt the African myth, and invariably we don't get to do that. And in a way, I'm going to answer your first question as well, I think, or at least attempt to, in that there is an intellectual laziness, and there is a otherness. We default, or our culture defaults to normative being white, and everything else being other, and therefore almost being exotic. Almost has to be there, that their racial profile is there as a dramatic element. And so there's a writer called Dominique Morisseau in the United States. Actually, she's just opening her show right now on Broadway. And she wrote a very interesting blog, I think in about 2011, where she said that all playwrights should no longer describe the race of anyone unless it's really specific. That you should just go Jen, Adrian, Kofi, and that somehow you'll be able to find the characteristic in the character. And so I think I would say that it is incumbent upon your generation of artists to actually adopt that, to actually stop white being normative. Because actually, and again I talk about London, but white isn't the default in London with over 40%. It isn't. Now, do I think that total ethnically neutral, bless you, neutral creation somehow denies us of our cultural specificity? I think there is a risk of that. But I also think that we have to we have to have multiple trains running at the same time. We often think we just do this one thing. Guess what? Colorblind casting or colorblind writing that's the solution. That's the magic bullet. And it's not by itself, because actually there are some days I describe myself as tricultural, right? I'm Ghanaian, I'm Grenadian, and I'm British. I'm from Accra, from St. George's, and I'm from West London, Southall in West London, right? That I have multiple identities. And some days, or some moments, and we all know this in terms of code switching, I'm my black self, and that's really important to be my black self or my Grenadian self or my Ghanaian self, and other times I'm just myself. And so artists need to be able to walk into a space where they can specifically choose the part of their identity that they wish to use at that moment in time. I don't want a world where everybody's just blandly written and we're all the same, because actually as an audience member, if a brown woman walks in, I'm trained to go, okay, why is that significant? And it takes me 10 minutes to work out, okay, it's not. And so we need lots of work like that. And then we also need lots of work where the brown woman walks in and I go, oh, that's really specific for this. So I think my answer to it would be, to sum up, would be we have to have more than one train running at the same time in order to get to the place where white isn't normative and where everybody can feel that there is a part of themselves in every piece of literature. Does that answer that?
Yeah, let's go to the hand at the back, if you can.
Hi, Kwame. Thank you for sharing. That was really useful. My question is about people who have a mid-career switch, or people who enter performance or enter theatre at a later age. So I see that there are a lot of opportunities for people between the ages of 16 to 30. But it seems like after 30, the opportunities or the grants or the collaborations or the offers, they tend to dry up. So I just want to get your thoughts on that. And do you have any advice for someone who is starting this later than 16 years old? Thank you.
Yeah, yes. Yes. I mean, I was a late starter in terms of, I didn't start writing until I was in my early 30s. Yeah, I think, certainly early 30s, probably early to mid. And I think one of the issues we have in theatre at the moment is that when we start thinking about how do we increase the pool in terms of gender, in terms of race, that actually we start thinking about what schemes we can create for the young. And actually, I think that by itself is foolhardy and actually has exhausted itself. That actually what we actually probably need to do, as well as creating schemes and entry points for the young, is find and invest in entry points for those who are older in terms of transferable skills. Now, for me, it's really important. When I became an artistic director, my first artistic director was actually in Senegal, where I was the AD of the World Festival of Black Arts and Culture. I'd never AD'd before, and I'd certainly never AD'd when I went to America in a regional theatre. I was a playwright. And so actually I managed and I ran my theatre and my festival. I say my hours, but as a playwright, using the drafting process that I use as a playwright with every decision that I'd make. The first question was like the first draft was just like, it's going to be really fat and kind of not really have a lot of structure to it, but I'm going to throw it to the wall so that it's out of me. And then I would have a consultation, obviously with my dramaturg or my director, and he'd throw it back and say, no, I think you need to think about it like that. And then I'd do a second draft and a third draft, and finally, hopefully by the fourth draft, I would make a decision. And I had to lead my team through my transferable skill as a playwright. And it works for me. The system is not necessarily used to that, but it works for me. So I think that we on the inside, particularly as we're now living in the age of resequence, where I think, as I was saying a little earlier to some, that actually we're all probably going to live to over 100, and certainly your generation, and that we're going to have to resequence our lives. We're going to have to be in education for longer. We're going to have 3 careers. And then we're going to have the last 25 or something to hang out and play with the great grandkids rather than just the grandkids. That actually we are going to have to open the gates and not just think about those who who are young, but we're going to have to find ways of speaking, of transferring skills in from older. And the final thing I'd say about that, one of the major problems, however, is that theatre in particular, very few of us do it for the money. You know, it's like, there's like 5% who make, like a really, really, really good living. And then everybody else does it. I'm not just saying just for the love, but, you know, it's not like television, it's not like industry. So invariably when you try and get someone who's been in advertising, for instance, to come and you know, all of their life, and now they want to direct, and they go, how much am I paid? Right? I've got a mortgage, I've got children. That actually, that's one of the barriers that we also have to overcome, is how to be attractive to those who are in other sectors, who might want to now live their art through the lens of theatre. Does that answer that at all? Thank you. Are you sure? You look like you weren't sure. All right.
I would say though, it is tough, like, because like you said, right, when you have like a mid-career switch, or like it's like you are 30, you have concerns like such as mortgage and like being able to sustain a living. Yeah, and it just seems like the industry is not shaped in a way that might be able to address those. It's not allowing you to live practically or to have a sustainable living. So, I mean, I take it that, yeah, we can definitely draw on the fact that at our age, when we do move back into, like, decide to switch to performance, we do have transferable skills, and we just have to dig deep and believe that those are the things that might be able to carry us through and allow for that transition. But at the same time, you know, it is, I mean, I'm not really sure about this question, but it is a comment. It's a bit of a struggle having to survive. Yeah,
it's a huge struggle, and I recognize that in it. And what's very interesting for me is that we then have to make that case to the foundations. We have to make that case to the Arts Council. We have to make that case that if we are going to need to source from outside of our sector, and that people will have to take huge pay cuts, how do we subsidize that? How do we fund that? How do we create the environment where it's not too painful? And I think in the not too far future that actually we're going to have to address it. We're going to have to find, and for instance, in America, there are many foundations that you can go to and just say, I think that the artist needs to be funded. In fact, there was a big arc of that funding that actually where they not stopped, but kind of preferred to look after the artist rather than look after the institution. And I think that actually we're going to have multiple mixed economies in terms of being able to allow later entrances into the arts to be able to sustain themselves. Good.
Yeah, let's kind of a hand on the front row if we can.
I'm glad you pushed back so I could.
Hi, Kwame. Thank you for existing. I wondered whether you could speak a bit more about your experiences in America versus your experiences here. There's definitely this impression that in order to make it as a black actor, as a black creative, you have to first go to America, make a name for yourself, come back. So what are your thoughts on this? And do you think American audiences are more perceptive to black creatives, black talent?
Thank you for existing, and thank you, and thank you for the positive energy that you send out. It's a really hard question to answer, and forgive me, I always do stories, right? But when I was a musician, and back in the day, there was a perception that the British soul artist was inferior to the American soul artist, quite understandably, because it was their thing, right? And so literally you'd get your record and you'd go to the record shop in terms of trying to get it distributed, and you'd say, hey, and they'd go, oh, it's British, right? And kind of not, and be like, okay. And then some really smart guys realized that that American records came in and they were shrink wrapped. And so you automatically knew that it was American. So lots of British artists then began to shrink wrap their records, and they'd go to the record store, and and the distributor would go, yo man, this is just straight out of Detroit, bro. You know what I mean? Yo man, no, this is, you know what I mean? And the guy, literally the same guys would play probably the same tune, and would be going, oh no, this is dope, yo, no, let's buy this, right? And there were so many of us that made a living out of shrink wrapping, that we couldn't. And I would say that, that there is, without a shadow of a doubt, there was a glass ceiling in our country. A glass ceiling that people like Idris Elba smashed. Relatively, that John Boyega smashed, that Chiwetel helped to smash, that Amel Amin helped to smash. And I don't think actually that many of them at the beginning, Idris, for example, Idris is one of the first. There was actually another actor called Eamon Walker who went up before all of us. And people just went, I just can't, I need something more. I think when you get to America, that, and there is, and again, this is just my opinion. I state it not as fact. But I think when you get to America, there's a thing that rubs, is that actually, whereas here we see the African American as the super black, the best blacks on the planet, right? It's like, yo, Beyonce, yeah, she belongs to that club, the best blacks, right? And so here we're kind of seen as slightly inferior, I would say, to the African American brand of blackness. When you go to America, it's the reverse. It's like the black Brit is seen as this, oh, yo, no, you the super Negro. and it's really weird, right? Because you're like, no, you're the super Negro. I'm the super Negro here, and now, and it's confusing. And it's really interesting. And again, my opinion, I state it not as fact, and certainly not possibly in New York and in LA. But sometimes that we would, as black British actors or black professionals, is that that white America, sometimes, not all, has this little sense of inferiority about the kind of Brits. You know, we got the Queen and shit, and you know what I mean, and we kind of speak English, and right, and there's this sense of again, and I would also say that the history of slavery and structural inequality has rendered possibly some white Americans to perceive the black as inferior, the African American as inferior, and so when they actually meet a black Brit, there's like kind of dissonance going on, because they're going to go, oh my God, I feel inferior, superior, inferior. You're talking, you sound like a Brit, but you're black and you're black. And you literally go, you see the faces. And literally some people are staring at your mouth going, but how does that sound come out? I don't understand it. And actually, it's really interesting to me because nearly all of my friends, that when they left London, they had like a kind of like broad Cockney accent. And then when they're in America, they sound like Prince Charles, and it's like 2 weeks. I'm like, yo, dude, you didn't sound like that in Hackney. Like, what are you doing? Where is it? You know? And you even get it from the taxi drivers. Like a taxi driver will get in, and you'll get into the cab, and they'll be like, where are you from? They'll be like, oh, great. And actually, one of the worst stories, and forgive this, it being slightly long, but I'll cut it, was I flew into San Francisco once, and I taped it, and I have it on my phone. I will never lose it, because it will sound like, I know someone's going to challenge me one day and say, that didn't happen, and I'm going to be able to play it. And they said, and he said, you know, I got off the flight, and I got to pick up my luggage, and he was the head of the company at the time. He couldn't get anybody else to pick me up, so it was his limousine company, planes, cars, and he said, I can't get anybody. I've had to come out and pick you up. It was like 4 a.m. in the morning. And then I said, oh, thank you. And he said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from London. He goes, I knew you were one of those. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, yeah, I knew you just wasn't one of ours. And of course, I'm terribly interested in that kind, so I kind of clicked my phone on record. And I pushed it a bit. I said, and so what do you mean? He said, well, there's just something about you European blacks. He said, it's the way that, and his uncle literally said, it's the way you've been matriculated. It's like it's like there is something about you that uses the European, has European sophistication mixed with the jungle. And ours just have the jungle. I'm like, yo, dog, at what point did you think it was cool to say that? I mean, at what point did you think I was going to go, oh, no, thank you so much. Oh, great. I've got, no, good. I'm glad you could see the jungle. And I was like, yo. And so actually, I say all of that not to cast all Americans in that light, in any form. I underline that in red. But there is something about us being the exotic in America that you also have to negotiate with in terms of... And so actually coming home is bittersweet to a degree, because actually you lose some of that status. You lose super Negro status. and you come back down to earth, and you know, people like bumping into you in the tube and stuff and like go, yo. Do you know what I mean? And assuming, like, I go into a shop and, you know, and the white person before me, they'll say, how can I help you, sir? And then they turn to me and go, you right, mate? I'm like, I'm not your mate, bro. Why was he sir and I'm mate? It doesn't make sense. Do you want me to show you the letters behind my name? No. But, and so that's the very long way around of saying that actually that we come home shrink wrapped. And so would I say to the next generation that you have to do that? I hope that there's now enough of us. I walk in, and again, I use Idris. I walk into Idris's office, and it's the most diverse office that I walk into. And I look at it, and I can see just by osmosis that actually that many in his office, from the head of legal to his PA to across the road, are people of color. I'm not saying it's exclusively, but it means it is. That if you go into my office and my space, that actually diversity is really important for us and letting the next generation of talent come through. My hope and my prayer is that your generation does not have to be shrink wrapped. That there's enough of us now, not just people of color, but also of our white allies who actually are saying, we want to live in a world that is equal. And I think my hope, and again, my prayer, is that your generation actually carries your own sheen, that you don't have to shrink wrap.
Well, thank you very much. That's an incredibly poignant place to end on, because unfortunately we've run out of time. So ladies and gentlemen, please do join with me in thanking Kwame for being with us.